Hello, my name is Devin Fuller and I'm a student enrolled at Bladen Community College online for Biology 168. My instructor is Mrs. Pamela Locklear King, and the following presentation is a video upload of a dissection of the sheep brain for our final week's assignment. Thank you. Alright, so if you take note of my surroundings, of course you see my PPE and mouse, but what I have is of course the specimen, which I have already cross-sectioned in order to make an earlier reference, clean it up a little bit so you guys can see what this actually is little pieces of pia matter that I've actually taken from the brain itself. The pia matter is adhered to the brain. The pia matter is the lowest or most inside layer of the connective or the protective fibrous tissue that surrounds the brain. Of course, the dura mater being attached to the skull, and between the pia mater and the dura mater is the arachnoid layer. Of course, what I have is a list of specific terms that I'm going to go over with you guys, as well as the instructions that were provided for proper identification and to utilize for this dissection. So I'm going to mount the camera, zoom in a little bit. Okay. So what we see right now is, of course, the sheep brain itself. This being the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Of course, the cerebrum is the largest portion of the brain, and the cerebellum is the smallest portion of the brain. It's also been called the mini brain or the small brain. And the cerebellum, of course, being responsible for fine motor coordination, being able to tactfully do fine motor movements. So what we have here also is we see the most furthest end of the medulla as well as the spinal cord here. Okay, so if we actually look at the brain itself, we see that there are two hemispheres which are separated by a longitudinal fissure and connected by the corpus callosum, which we'll get into a little bit later. When we see the certain sections of the brain, there are actually different lobes that we will see. Of course, we have the parietal lobe. Of course, just like the skull, if you want to make reference to that, you have the parietal skull, the occipital skull, the frontal bone, occipital bone, parietal bones, and of course the temporal that's attached to the zygomatic bone or the zygomass. So what we have here is, of course, the frontal lobes of the brain. We have the occipital, or most rearest portion. We have the parietal lobes, and there's a small piece of brain, which I'm going to separate the two halves right now, that juts out underneath, and that is the temporal lobe. Of course, the temporal lobe being the area that's closest to the ear. So, also the temporal lobe houses an area called the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is, of course, responsible for long-term as well as short-term memory. So once we go through and we see, of course, the cerebrum, cerebellum, frontal, parietal, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe, we turn the brain underneath and we look, we'll see these two little protrusions right here. These are the olfactory bulbs, responsible for smell, which go down the olfactory tract. And we can barely see it, but this little area right here, which I cross-sectioned on a different area, there's two little points that jut out here. This is where the ocular nerves would come in. Okay, they would come into the ocular chasm, which is where they X. If you go back to the video that I did before about the skull and going through the bones of the face, you saw that there were two fascia, or two openings in the back of the skull, or in the back of the orbits, or the eye sockets. That's where the optic nerves come in, and they do that X, as I said before, at the octave chiasm, which goes to the octave tracts that go to the back. And of course, if we look at this particular area, we'll have the spinal cord, which goes to the medulla, and then you'll see that there's a little prominence that sticks out, and that's the pons. Okay, so once we've actually done the cross-section of the brain, some of the other items will be a little bit easier to see. Sorry, I have to go through and do this on a different area. So what we have here, if we come up and we follow the brain, we have the spinal cord that goes to the medulla, which there's this little indentation here that indicates that this area is going to be the pons, okay, which will come up into the midbrain. Okay, so what we have here is the optic nerve, or the optic chiasm that's been dissected and transected across. So if we look in here, what we'll find is a little cavern. Okay, and then we have another little cavern that's up in this area. down here, which this is not going to separate properly, but that's all right. We have this little area here. So if we see in this area as everything comes up, we have the cerebellum, we have the cerebrum, and then we have the midbrain, which the midbrain has in this area. You have the hypothalamus, which sits above the thalamus, and you have this one little area that's jutting back here, and that's the pineal gland. Okay, so all of this is actually housed with different ventricles that help with cerebrospinal fluid. And this is the central canal that comes up by the fourth ventricle. Okay, and if you follow it and go down from 4, 3, 2, 1, you'll have the fourth ventricle, the third ventricle, and then you will have the lateral ventricle. Let's see if we can actually see it on an easier side. Looks like it's easier to see it on the other side. Then you have, of course, that fibrous tissue that connects both hemispheres of the brain called the corpus callosum. So underneath the hypothalamus, there will be a separate little section that comes down that sits a master gland inside the sella turcica of the skull, which is that little indentation that's on the bottom. So if you have the skull and you have the eye here and one eye here that comes through with those fossa, on each side of the fossa sits the sella turcica, which is that bony indentation inside the skull, which fits your master gland or your pituitary gland, and that is actually attached through something called the infundibulum. So here's another cross section, another view. So what we're going to try and do is actually take a cross section right now of the brain itself, just a lateral. Try and see if we can utilize and see the difference between the gray matter and the white matter. So, once again, of course, like I stated before, if you want, you can try and peel a little section, and you can just barely see it. But this is the outer protective coating on the brain called the pia mater. And there, just that little fibrous tissue. Okay. Hope you guys learned something. And if you have any questions, please feel free to leave the questions in the comments. Thanks. And thank you for watching.